Thank you. Guten Tag, ich heiße J.J. Warren. Ich komme aus den USA und ich spreche nur ein bisschen Deutsch, also freut es mich, dass heute alles auf Englisch ist. So now that I've greeted you in the native language of our great university, Universität Wien, I'll continue in my native language, which is convenient because that's about as much German as I know. For now, I'm still learning. The title of my dissertation presentation is Ontological Queerness, toward a liberative ecclesiology through queer theory and systematic theology, which is perhaps a stereotypically long American academic title. And this project is supervised under the very capable supervision of Professor Christian Danz, as well as my thesis advisory committee, which has Dr. Brandon Crowley from Harvard Divinity School in Cambridge. Now, to provide a brief overview to situate where my work fits within theological discourse, this work is a conscious work of liberation theology, meaning that my dissertation works upon the fundamental presupposition that God is experienced today among movements of liberation by the oppressed. As an example of how this claim works within liberation theology, the Black liberation theologian James Cone wrote that, quote, "Black theology merely tries to discern the activity of the Holy One in achieving the purpose of liberation of humankind from the forces of oppression," end quote, which at his time and sadly still today in the United States means that, quote, "the Black community itself is precisely where Jesus Christ needs to be at work," end quote. So I give this quote just to show an example of how the universal claim of liberation theology, that God is on the side of the oppressed, is particularized within the Black community. And my project seeks to particularize the claim of liberation theology within the LGBTQ community. So essentially to say that there is some distinct quality of the divine that is present within works of liberation by LGBTQ plus persons, and furthermore that queerness itself is a quality of being, which we'll get into later in the presentation and in the dissertation. Furthermore, my project is situated within queer theory. Specifically, my dissertation will utilize Butler's books, Gender Trouble, The Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, as well as Bodies That Matter on the Discursive Limits of Sex, to show how queer theory is a particular process of deconstruction within the critical method broadly conceived. And queer theory specifically demonstrates how to challenge the fixity and determinate natures of binary categories such as gender and sex, and the corresponding compulsory heterosexuality. Finally, I will apply Paul Tillich's method of systematic theology, which is both critical and constructive, he says, and the remainder of this presentation will show you how I intend to do that, namely by incorporating Judith Butler's work in queer theory as the critical principle within systematic theology. So let's get to it. Applying Tillich's method of the systematic theology. Even if one hasn't dared to open Tillich's dense 3-volume magnum opus of the systematic theology, one is probably aware of the term the method of correlation. Or if not, you've at least heard one of Danz's numeral doctoral students mention this phrase in the hallways here. Essentially, the method of correlation, as Tillich says, quote, "is the method of correlation explains the contents of the Christian faith through existential questions and theological answers in mutual interdependence." And so my project raises the existential question of what could overcome the estrangement, here particularly focusing on the strangeness that is often regarded with LGBTQ people. What could overcome the estrangement between persons of various gender and sexual identities that is embedded in Western culture's general heteronormativity, and specifically within the life of the churches and in our articulation of a doctrine of the church itself? Essentially what I mean is, how do we acknowledge and affirm that there are persons who don't fit into the basic binary categories of heteronormativity, such as male and female, masculine and feminine, and the compulsory heterosexuality that these categories necessitate? And this is a theological question, because how can we love someone who doesn't exist in our language or in our laws? How can we care for someone who, when the heteronormative structures through which we perceive them are inadequate or are intentionally dehumanizing? So this existential question, with theological implications, raises and necessitates a theological answer. And my thesis is that the anticipated theological answer is what Tillich calls the community of the new being, that is, the church. As my former advisor at Boston University, Brian Stone, writes in his book, the church is a new peoplehood, a new body, and a new way of life. And so my question is that my statement is that this way of life of the church must respond theologically to the existential question of identity that I've just raised in the previous slide. Therefore, in order to get there, queerness must be understood as an ontological concept. That is, being itself is to be regarded as queer, as transcending the confines and determinate categories of heteronormativity, which have predetermined the nature of experience through the erasure of LGBTQIA+ persons. And furthermore, that the church, if it is the community of this new queer being, it must then understand itself as fundamentally queer. To use Tillichian language, the church must understand itself as pointing beyond itself toward and participating in a depth of experience that transcends the divisions and schema of heteronormativity. And if this is done theologically, then the church is open to new and diverse expressions of its own communal life, expressions that enable it to actualize potentialities that were previously foreclosed to it by heteronormativity. And the church then is able to enable others to actualize their potentialities as well. It can provide the theological ground from which the proliferation of various gender and sexual identities can emerge and are given open-ended meaning, affirmation, and intelligibility within community. So how will I do all of this? To briefly provide an overview of where I think the project is going for now, my dissertation will introduce this topic by reiterating what I've shared here, namely that I'm incorporating Judith Butler's theory and queer theory generally into systematic theology as the critical principle. From there, I'll go into chapter 1, which will provide a brief introduction and overview of queer theory and its applications in the foundational works of queer theology. And those are, namely, Radical Love, An Introduction to Queer Theology by Patrick Chang, Our Lives Matter, A Womanist Queer Theology by Pamela Lexie, and 3, The Queer God, Sexuality and Liberation Theology by Marcella Althaus-Rien. As my expose explains, all of these works operate some more than others explicitly from within queer theory's general rejection of ontological discourse. And so chapter 2, of course, will then compare and contrast Tillich and Butler's uses of epistemology and how they use epistemology to challenge the ontological frameworks of their contemporaries. And chapter 2 will then need to discuss the linguistic and philosophical discourses on the evolution of the subject and the self. Chapter 3 will then explore how to reintroduce ontological discourse into queer theology using Tillich's ontological method and going beyond it, and specifically citing James Cone, who almost instantly used Tillich's ontological approach to claim that God is ontologically black. I will, of course, address Cone's critics, namely Victor Anderson and his work Beyond Ontological Blackness. Of course, theory and practice are not totally distinct from one another, and therefore chapter 4, as I conclude, will explain the applications of this theory of ontological queerness that it anticipated and was created for, namely a liberative doctrine and praxis of the church that frees our communities from the constraints of heteronormativity that hinder every aspect of the church's life, from liturgy and worship to mission and evangelism. And I will conclude by providing a few remarks on potential research topics to follow this project. So, vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit, and do you have any questions?